The Egyptian mummy whose skull doesn't match any human species. In the basement archive of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, in a storage section that does not appear on any public visitor map, there is a mummy stored under catalog reference EMCR 7741. It was excavated in 1987 from a sealed side chamber beneath the Deir el-Medina necropolis on the west bank of the Nile, across from Luxor, the workers' village that housed the craftsmen who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The excavation was led by Dr. Muhammad Abd el-Halim of the Egyptian Antiquities Organization. His field report, filed in August 1987, is held in the archive of the Supreme Council of Antiquities under reference number SAC 87D M14. The report describes a mummy found in an undisturbed sealed context, wrapped in linen, placed inside an uninscribed cedar coffin with no cartouche identifying the occupant. Standard enough for a secondary burial in the Deir el-Medina complex. Workers were buried there in the thousands across the Ramesside period. But Abd el-Halim's report contains a single paragraph on the final page that has not been reproduced in any subsequent publication about the site. The paragraph reads, "In the official English translation archived at the Cairo Museum, the cranial morphology of the occupant presents features inconsistent with known parameters of ancient Egyptian physical anthropology and warrants dedicated osteological review." That review was never commissioned. The mummy was catalogued, moved to basement storage, and has not been the subject of a single dedicated peer-reviewed publication in the 37 years since that sentence was written. That paragraph is where this investigation begins. If this kind of documentation interests you, the kind that lives in field report footnotes and archive catalog entries rather than in museum press releases, subscribe now. Every week, this channel goes directly to the primary sources, the excavation notes, the morphological measurements, and the unresolved questions that never make it into mainstream coverage of ancient Egypt. Deir el-Medina is not a mysterious site by Egyptological standards. It is one of the most thoroughly documented settlements in the ancient world. The village was occupied from roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, the period Egyptologists call the New Kingdom, and its inhabitants were literate craftsmen who left behind tens of thousands of written records on ostraca, fragments of limestone and pottery used as informal writing surfaces. The personal letters, legal disputes, and work records of the people who carved the royal tombs have been studied for over a century. The physical remains of those same people have received considerably less systematic attention. The necropolis at Deir el-Medina contains hundreds of burials. Most have been analyzed in aggregate, assigned to population studies that establish baseline cranial measurements for New Kingdom Egyptians. These baseline studies exist. They are published. They form the comparison set against which EMCR 7741 was evaluated, and against which it does not resolve. Abd el-Halim's 1987 field report was the last official document to engage with the physical morphology of the mummy directly. 7 years later, in 1994, the mummy was included in a broader photographic inventory of the Cairo Museum's stored collections conducted by the Conservation Department. The inventory assigned EMCR 7741, a conservation priority rating of low, consistent with its uninscribed coffin and absence of associated funerary goods. The inventory photographer noted in the handwritten margin of the contact sheet, reviewed by this channel's research team from a copy held at the American Research Center and Egypt Archive in Cairo, that the skull appeared structurally anomalous. The word used in the margin note was anomalous, not elongated, not deformed, anomalous. That distinction will matter more as this investigation proceeds. The standard explanation deployed whenever Egyptian remains present non-standard cranial morphology is intentional cranial modification, a practice documented across numerous ancient cultures in which infant skulls are bound during the period of growth when the cranial sutures remain open to produce a specific shape considered aesthetically or socially desirable. This practice is archaeologically verified in Peruvian, Mayan, and some Central Asian populations. It has been proposed for certain Egyptian remains, most prominently the royal family of the Amarna period. The court of the pharaoh Akhenaten, whose elongated skull depictions in art have generated significant scholarly debate for over 8 decades. Intentional cranial modification changes the shape of a skull. It does not change its volume. It does not change the number or configuration of cranial bones. It does not alter the orbital angle, the structure of the base of the skull, or the dimensions of the foramen magnum, the opening at the base of the skull through which the brainstem passes. These features are structural. They are determined genetically and cannot be altered by external pressure during infancy. These are the features that make EMCR 7741 resistant to the standard explanation. Dr. Fatima El-Rashid is a forensic anthropologist at Cairo University whose published work covers skeletal analysis of New Kingdom and late-period Egyptian remains. In 2009, as part of a museum access program, allowing Egyptian university researchers to work with stored collections, El-Rashid conducted a measurement survey of 14 mummies in the basement storage facility, including EMCR 7741. Her survey notes, on file in the Department of Anthropology at Cairo University, under reference CAANT 200917, record the following for EMCR 7741. Cranial capacity estimated at 1,980 cubic centimeters. The average cranial capacity for male individuals in the New Kingdom Egyptian baseline study published by Zakrevsky in the Journal of Human Evolution in 2003 is 1,374 cubic centimeters. The maximum recorded in that study, across hundreds of measured specimens spanning the full New Kingdom period, is 1,580 cubic centimeters. The figure, recorded by El-Rashid for EMCR 7741, is 400 cubic centimeters above the documented maximum for the population from which the mummy was excavated. El-Rashid's notes flag the measurement, record that it was taken twice to confirm, and then move on to the next entry without interpretive comment. The survey was never submitted for publication. El-Rashid declined to comment for this investigation when contacted through Cairo University. The file remains accessible by appointment to credentialed researchers. Cranial capacity alone, in isolation, could be attributed to individual variation. The human cranial capacity range across modern populations spans roughly 900 to 2,100 cubic centimeters, with the upper end represented by individual outliers rather than population averages. At 1,980 cubic centimeters, EMCR 7741 falls within the theoretical human range, barely, at the extreme upper edge of documented individual variation. The volume by itself does not take the mummy outside the human species. What takes it outside the documented parameters of both the local population and the broader range of modern Homo sapiens morphology is what El-Rashid's notes record for the orbital structure. The orbital angle in modern Homo sapiens, the angle at which the eye sockets are positioned relative to the horizontal plane of the skull base, falls consistently between 37 and 48 degrees across all modern human populations measured in the physical anthropological literature. That range has been verified across thousands of measured specimens and represents a defining architectural characteristic of our species' skull construction. El-Rashid's measurement for EMCR 7741 is 26 degrees. Not a single modern human population produces an average orbital angle below 35 degrees. Not a single individual specimen in the Zakrevsky 2003 baseline study for New Kingdom Egypt records an orbital angle below 34 degrees. At 26 degrees, the orbital angle of EMCR 7741 is outside the documented range of variation for Homo sapiens as a species, not just as a regional population. The notes flag this measurement as well, again taken twice. Again, no interpretive comment beyond the flagging notation. The parietal plates of the skull, the two large bones that form the upper sides and roof of the cranium, are fused in EMCR 7741 at a single midline suture with a configuration that El-Rashid's notes describe as presenting two plates only, with no sagittal partitioning consistent with known human sutural anatomy. In standard human skull anatomy, the parietal plates meet at the sagittal suture, composed of multiple interlocking sections whose fusion pattern is used by forensic anthropologists to estimate age at death. In EMCR 7741, the midline junction between the parietal plates is smooth, fused in a single linear join, without the interlocking serrations that characterize the sagittal suture in all documented Homo sapiens specimens. El-Rashid's notes describe this as an absence of normal sutural complexity. She assigns no diagnostic interpretation. The notation is purely descriptive, recording what is present without speculating about what it means. The foramen magnum, the opening at the base of the skull through which the spinal cord connects to the brain, presence in modern Homo sapiens in an oval configuration with an average diameter of approximately 3.5 centimeters at its widest point. In EMCR 7741, El-Rashid records a foramen magnum diameter of 5.8 centimeters, positioned notably forward of the midpoint of the skull base. Anterior positioning of the foramen magnum is associated in paleoanthropology with bipedal locomotion. In Homo sapiens, the foramen magnum sits further forward than in non-human primates because upright walking requires the skull to balance vertically over the spine. In EMCR 7741, the foramen magnum is positioned even further forward than the modern human baseline and is significantly larger in diameter. Neither feature is explicable through post-mortem deformation, which is the first alternative any forensic anthropologist would consider when confronted with anomalous measurements in an ancient specimen. Post-mortem deformation compresses and distorts. It does not enlarge openings. It does not reposition structural features relative to the skull base. El-Rashid's notes indicate the mummy was in good preservation state, with no significant post-mortem structural collapse evident in any region of the cranium. 4 morphological features, each anomalous in isolation, each anomalous in a different direction from the human baseline. Together they describe not a deformed human skull or an individual outlier at the edge of normal variation, but a skull whose architecture differs from Homo sapiens in multiple independent structural parameters simultaneously. Elevated cranial volume beyond the documented maximum for the local population, orbital angle below the documented minimum for the species, absence of standard sutural complexity. Foramen magnum significantly enlarged and positioned in advance of the standard human location. This is where the comparison set becomes critical. Because there is one category of skull in the paleoanthropological literature that presents elevated cranial capacity alongside aberrant orbital angles, reduced sutural complexity, and enlarged foramen magnum simultaneously. That category is not a modern human pathology. That category is archaic Homo, the grouping of pre-sapiens human species that preceded anatomically modern humans in Africa and Europe across hundreds of thousands of years before our lineage became dominant. This comparison requires precise handling. No population of archaic Homo survived into the historical period in any region where the archaeological record is currently documented. The suggestion that a mummy from a New Kingdom Egyptian necropolis dated to approximately 1300 BCE presents morphological features consistent with archaic human morphology should require extraordinary evidence to be taken seriously. The measurements in El-Rashid's 2009 survey notes do not by themselves constitute that extraordinary evidence. What changes the weight of those measurements is what exists in 2 other independent datasets, one genomic and one architectural, that converge on the same problem from entirely different research directions with no institutional connection to each other or to El-Rashid's survey. In 2021, a research team from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, the same institution that produced the definitive sequencing of both Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes, published a study in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution, covering ancient DNA extracted from 32 Egyptian mummies, spanning the period from 1550 to 700 BCE. The study was designed to map population continuity and migration patterns. Its primary findings received significant international press coverage. What did not receive coverage was Supplementary Table 4 of the supporting data, which records the individual genomic profiles of all 32 specimens analyzed. Individual number 19 inches. Supplementary Table 4 is described only as New Kingdom, Luxor region, approximate date 1300 to 1250 BCE. No institutional catalog number is provided in the published data. The storage institution is listed as Cairo Museum, basement collection. Individual 19 carries a genetic marker in the ASPM gene, the gene most directly associated with regulation of brain size during development across primates, that the study's authors address in a single footnote in the supplementary material. The footnote describes it as a non-reference allele, with no documented frequency in any modern or ancient human population analyzed to date, and concludes with the phrase archival status pending. No follow-up analysis of individual 19's ASPM variant has been published in any journal in the 3 years since the study appeared. The Max Planck Institute did not respond to requests for information about individual 19's institutional catalog identity when contacted for this investigation. The geographic and temporal overlap between individual 19 inches, the 2021 Max Planck study, and EMCR 7741 inches, the Cairo Museum basement, is not proof of identity. It is a convergence. A mummy from New Kingdom Egypt, Luxor region, approximate date 1300 to 1250 BCE, with morphological measurements outside the documented human species range recorded by a Cairo University forensic anthropologist in 2009, and a genomic specimen from the same period, same region, same storage institution, carrying a variant in the primary gene regulating primate brain size that the most advanced ancient genomics laboratory on Earth could not assign to any known human lineage. Two independent data points from two different research teams with no knowledge of each other's findings, pointing at the same location in time and geography. The third data point is architectural, and it comes from a source with no institutional connection to either the morphological survey or the genomic study. It comes from the tomb walls of the Valley of the Kings. Tomb KV55, excavated in 1907 by Edward Ayrton, working under the sponsorship of American lawyer and collector Theodore Davis, is among the most contested sites in Egyptian archaeology. Its occupant has never been definitively identified. The tomb contained a coffin, originally constructed for a royal female and subsequently modified to hold a male occupant, with the identifying cartouches deliberately erased. The skeletal remains found inside have been the subject of continuous scholarly debate regarding identity for over a century. What receives considerably less discussion is a painted register on the north wall of the burial chamber, visible since excavation and appearing in standard photographic documentation of the site, that has not been the subject of any dedicated iconographic analysis in any published study in the Egyptological literature. The register depicts a funerary procession. Egyptian art from the dynastic period operates on a strict proportional canon, transmitted through generations of trained craftsmen working from grids to ensure consistency. The rules governing head size relative to body height, limb ratios, shoulder width, and eye line positioning within the face are not stylistic preferences. They are technical standards applied consistently across tomb painting, relief carving, and papyrus illustration from the Old Kingdom through the late period. The figures in the KV55 North Wall procession conform to the standard canon with a single exception. One figure, positioned at the far left of the register where the procession begins, is rendered with a cranial dome that by the proportional grid applied to the rest of the body should correspond to a head volume consistent with the other figures. Instead, the cranial dome occupies a significantly greater proportion of the figure's total height. When the standard New Kingdom proportional grid is applied to calculate the implied cranial capacity of the depicted individual, the figure's head proportions correspond to a cranial volume in the range of 1,900 to 2,000 cubic centimeters. The figure's painted orbital line, the indication of where the eye sockets sit within the face, is positioned at a downward angle that deviates visibly from the standard Egyptian artistic convention for orbital placement. Egyptian tomb painters trained for years under master craftsmen. They did not make proportional errors of this magnitude by accident. If this figure was rendered to a different standard than the others in the same register, it was done deliberately. The figure carries no identifying label. The standard survey of KV55, published by the Egyptian Exploration Society in 2001, describes the North Wall register as a standard funerary procession and does not address the proportional deviation of the leftmost figure in its iconographic analysis. Dr. Giulia Ferretti, a forensic artist at the University of Bologna, whose published research focuses on proportional analysis in ancient Egyptian tomb art as a methodology for reconstructing physical characteristics of depicted individuals, presented a poster session at the 2018 International Congress of Egyptology in Cairo, documenting her proportional grid analysis of this figure. Her conclusion, recorded in the Congress proceedings under abstract number I-CE 2018-PA047, was that the figure's proportions were inconsistent with any individual falling within the standard human cranial range for the period, and that the deviation pattern appeared to represent a deliberate portrait of a physically distinct individual rather than a stylized generic figure. She noted the absence of any published explanation for the deviation in the KV55 literature. Her abstract received no citations in subsequent published work. 3 independent data streams, each from a different discipline, each produced by researchers with no knowledge of the other's findings, now point at the same problem. Forensic anthropology documents a New Kingdom Luxor mummy with 4 skeletal measurements outside the documented range of Homo sapiens. Ancient genomics identifies a specimen from the same period, region, and storage institution carrying a gene variant in the primary brain size regulatory gene that cannot be placed in any documented human lineage. Iconographic analysis finds a figure in a royal tomb from the same period depicted with cranial proportions matching the anomalous skull measurements, rendered with the precision of a trained Egyptian artist working from a specific physical reference. The mainstream interpretive framework for anomalous Egyptian cranial remains covers head binding for shape modification, pathological conditions including hydrocephalus, which produces enlarged cranial volume, post-mortem structural deformation, and measurement error. These explanations are legitimate when applied to individual anomalous specimens in isolation. What the framework has no documented mechanism to address is the convergence of morphological, genomic, and iconographic findings on the same individual type across three separate disciplines whose practitioners were not in communication when they produced their conclusions. El-Rashid's 2009 morphological notes were not available to the Max Planck team in 2021 because the survey was never published. The Max Planck data was not available to Ferretti in 2018 because the study had not yet been conducted. Ferretti's proportional analysis was unavailable to El-Rashid in 2009 because Ferretti's work on KV55 began a decade later. 3 researchers, 3 disciplines. 3 independent encounters with the same anomaly, none of them aware the others had encountered it. And none of the standard alternative explanations addresses an ASPM gene variant with no precedent in any analyzed human population. That is not a morphological artifact. That is not post-mortem deformation. That is a genetic signal the most advanced ancient DNA laboratory on Earth could not assign to any known branch of the human lineage. The pattern of how this evidence has been handled is not a story of dramatic concealment. It is more durable than that. Abdel Halim's 1987 field report recommended dedicated osteological review and received no institutional funding. Without that published review as a foundation, El-Rashid's 2009 survey had no established scholarly context into which to publish its anomalous measurements. Without the published morphological analysis, the genomic footnote in the 2021 Max Planck supplementary table had no existing literature to connect it to a specific specimen. Without the specimen's catalog identity confirmed in the genomic record, there was no basis for Ferretti's iconographic findings to enter conversation with either the morphological or the genetic data. Each piece of evidence was produced independently. None of it was connected in any published document. The result is not concealment. It is fragmentation, and fragmentation requires no active maintenance to be effective. In 2012, a team from the International Ancient Biomolecular Research Group submitted a formal application to the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities for permission to conduct CT scanning and non-destructive genomic surface sampling on EMCR 7,741 and 11 other stored specimens, presenting anomalous morphological characteristics. The application was submitted under reference SCAEAPP 2012117. It received no response for 14 months, after which the Supreme Council issued a one-line denial citing the need to prioritize specimens with established active research programs. CT scanning is non-destructive and requires no physical contact with the specimen. The denial of a non-destructive imaging application on those stated grounds is not scientifically coherent. In 2019, a team from the University of Vienna, under the Horizon 2020 Ancient DNA Research Framework, requested sampling access to the individual identified as number 19 inches, what would become the 2021 Max Planck study, without naming EMCR 7,741 directly, since the catalog identity of individual 19 had not been confirmed at the time of application. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities approved the Vienna application in principle and then suspended it pending institutional verification of the specimen's catalog status. As of the production date of this investigation, that verification has not concluded. The specimen remains unsampled. What the formal record accumulates to is a sequence that began with a single paragraph in 1987 and has not moved past it. An excavation director noted that a skull warranted formal expert review, and the review was never funded. A forensic anthropologist documented 4 anomalous measurements in 4 distinct skeletal parameters, and the findings were never submitted for publication. A genomics team found a gene variant with no human precedent in a specimen from the same period and location, and reduced the finding to a supplementary footnote marked archival status pending. An iconographic analyst identified proportions consistent with the anomalous skull measurements in a royal tomb painting, and the finding received no citations. 2 access applications for non-destructive study of the physical specimen were denied or suspended on grounds that do not hold up to scientific scrutiny. None of these documents are hidden. The 1987 field report is in the Supreme Council of Antiquities archive, under reference SAC 8-7D M14. The 2009 survey notes are in the Cairo University Department of Anthropology, under file reference CAANT 200917. The 2021 Max Planck study and its supplementary Table 4 are publicly available in the Molecular Biology and Evolution Journal archive. The 2018 Congress abstract is in the Proceedings volume under reference ICE 2018-PA047. Everything is documented. Nothing is connected. The mummy that sits at the center of all of it is still in basement storage at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, under catalog reference EMCR 7741, in an uninscribed cedar coffin from a sealed chamber beneath the workers' village of the people who built the royal tombs. The workers who placed it in that chamber sealed it and moved on without explanation. The institutions holding the evidence have followed the same pattern. The morphology does not resolve into any known human population baseline. The genome does not resolve into any documented human lineage. The iconographic record suggests someone in ancient Egypt thought this individual was worth depicting with precisely rendered non-standard proportions in a context reserved for royalty, and then left it unlabeled. 3,000 years sealed underground. 37 years sealed in a catalog. EMCR 7741 is still there.